the hustle culture we're in. The more you do, the more you're busy and stressed. That means you're being productive. That means you're someone who's progressing in life somehow. Maybe there's another way. Maybe we can be more present and don't have to be sprinting all the time.
Of course, we always want to be developing ourselves, but when it's at the expense of joy and connection and love, then I think we can start to bring a curiosity to what actually are we doing here.
Dr. Linda Cantor is a psychologist and mindfulness teacher from Cape Town, South Africa.
Being more present, learning to slow down, learning to meet what's uncomfortable becomes the hugest challenge, but also the hugest gift. The deepest aspects of ourselves, which for me is the deepest aspect of the heart. I believe that the heart knows. The heart has an essential goodness and wisdom. What this practice is an action. It's not just about sitting on the mat meditating, but it's in our relationality and in the meeting of the difficulty, in the meeting of this moment.
Mindfulness is not about disconnecting. It's about connecting, meeting ourselves so we can meet the world differently. Hello, everyone. I'm thrilled to share today's conversation with such a kind, intelligent academic, counseling psychologist, a mindfulness teacher, and teacher trainer from all the way in Cape Town, South Africa. My guest today is Dr. Linda Cantor. Join us as we explore the role of mindfulness in leadership, work setting, healing, stress, and social activism, and the benefits of building attitudes of compassion, nonviolence, and collaboration in workplaces and life. For a little more background, Dr. Cantor has been deeply committed to bringing mindfulness interventions like mindfulness based stress reduction or MBSR to South African contexts and sharing her work in a variety of settings, including corporate workshops, community based interventions. Since 2009, she developed a 2 year mindful leadership program, which she teaches part time for the executive MBA program at the Graduate School of Business in Cape Town. She also completed her PhD by looking at applications, understandings, and perceived impact of mindfulness in the organizational context. And she's a co founder of a self development platform, Inara, and I'll put the link below, which offers personalized transformational journeys that prioritize wellness, flourishing, and social activism. Dr. Linda Cantor, welcome to the Pause to Elevate podcast.
Thank you so much, Kasim. It's such an honor and a pleasure to be here. Having had a look at the guests you've interviewed before, I feel deeply honored and humbled to be in this space with you.
Well, thank you so much. It truly is a pleasure. And thank you for joining us. I know it's really late where you are in South Africa right now. So thank you for making it work. Really appreciate it. And I wonder if we can start with, I was looking at one of your websites and I love the sentence you have there that I wanted to read for listeners and just get your thoughts on it, which is so beautiful. And you have there on your website this question: can you see the possibility of knowing this truth? You are perfect as you are, that you have inside of you all the wisdom that you need. How beautiful is that? Can you say a little about that? Given that so many of us feel this imposter syndrome, we're not perfect, I'm not enough. So, can you share a little bit about that sentence? What does it mean to be perfect as you are?
Thanks, Kasim. And I love how like we get quizzical when we hear that, because the mind immediately starts doubting. Like, can that be possible? Like, generally I find that our storyline is one of inadequacy and lack and comparing. The mind compares and judges and competes, and so much of that is about our conditioning. And so few of us have being guided into the space of like deep connection to the deepest aspects of
Mm,
ourselves, which for me is the deepest aspect of the heart. And in that space of deep self, there's nothing wrong. There's wholeness. There's perfection,
mm,
and that the mind gets really confused when it hears that. But I believe that the heart knows. The heart knows. The
mm,
heart has an essential goodness and wisdom. The body knows it has an essential wisdom. And when we
mm,
can open up to these more whole aspects of ourselves. I think it was the kind of fountainhead of wisdom that's inside of us. Then we might find that in this moment, if we just wake up to this moment right here, right now, it is perfect. You know, I know you and I, as we were
mm,
grappling with the technology and everything, and I noticed my own edginess. And now, as I'm talking to you and I'm settling back into my heart, I'm just recognizing the
mm,
perfection of that moment and the perfection of how we worked on it together. So
mm,
essentially, I think that the work of certainly my work is about guiding us to know that space from the mind to the heart and to navigate that
mm.
journey.
Beautifully said. And for the listener as well, we should have recorded that portion. We had like 45 minutes or so of like technical challenges, but I really think this was like a sample of what's possible when we do this mindfulness work, because it was stressful, right, for both of us. And it was like, how do we collaborate? How do we feel the discomfort of things? How do we lean into it? um how do we deal with unpleasant when it shows up, like technology not working? So it was, thank you for your graciousness and this kind persistence as we figured it out, which is like the backstory for listeners.
Absolutely. I mean, I think it is the story because what I noticed as we were doing that, there was a point at which I felt your kindness, Kasim, and the way
Mm,
that you were kind of holding and supporting this process. And as somebody who's always like a little
mm,
bit resistant to technology, I was noticing my edginess, but there was something about the kindness with which you were meeting that and we met it together
mm,
ultimately, and that for me
mm,
is what this practice is in action. You know, I mean, it's not just
mm,
about sitting on the mat, you know, meditating, but it's in our relationality and in the meeting of the difficulty, in the meeting of this moment. And so, you know, I think our entry
mm.
point into this conversation was testimony to the practice.
This is so true. And you're pointing to something that I'd love to return to as well as we explore many things, which is how, the mindfulness is not about disconnecting and just taking time from the day and isolating ourselves, and that's it. It's about connecting, meeting ourselves so we can meet the world differently. And there's introspection, time with ourselves, which can be hard. So what led you to this mindfulness journey yourself? I'm curious, how did it all begin? Where you've really dedicated your work now to this mindfulness and workplace, but just mindfulness. What led you to that journey?
Yeah, I think that's such a layered question for me, Kasim, because I kind of feel like maybe in a way I was born into it. And the reason why I say that is, you know, my grandparents and my mother were survivors of the Holocaust.
Mm,
And
yeah.
so I grew up in Africa, but essentially they came
Mm,
from Europe. And there was always this kind of feeling because I was always aware that there was something not quite right. So I think I was probably aware of their
mm,
trauma. And then also I grew up in a place called Rhodesia where there was, you know, there was a war, there were things going on
mm,
that I was trying to make sense of from a young age. So I think in a way
mm,
grew up. I was born and I grew up in a kind of quest for understanding separation and what brings people
mm,
together and what brings peace and a real love and a desire for peace. And so I think yeah, I naturally navigated to these practices from quite a young age, and I think also
Mm,
just as ways of dealing with my own levels of anxiety and insecurity. I studied
mm,
as a psychologist, and when I was studying as a psychologist, there was always this question for me around, but surely there's something innate inside of us as human beings that is already
mm,
healing, that is already whole. Um, but all the models that I was learning as a psychologist were very much about, the psychologist being in a certain position,
mm.
not sharing your own stuff. Um,
Right. Power dynamic. Yeah.
Completely, and it just felt like a power dynamic, and it also felt like there was a missing of an aspect of us, of our humanity, that I wasn't being taught in psychology. And
Mm,
when I discovered the practice, so I was a meditator. I was a transcendental meditator for a long time. I was very religious
mm,
about my practice, morning and evening, and I was a very good meditator. But when I discovered, the path of mindfulness, it's like the penny dropped, because, it's kind of like, well, what
mm,
about the time in between those 20-minute practices? How am I the rest of the time? So I think there was a discovery for me personally in discovering mindfulness meditation, but there was also this
mm.
incredible discovery when I started to introduce it and started to run groups, not quite knowing what I was doing, but I started to teach it. And I saw the impact on people, people that I'd been holding as a therapist. Suddenly, the practice
Mm,
just added a whole nother dimension to how I could work with them and how they could meet themselves. And I think that
mm.
that was, for me, was like the missing piece. I realized, oh, this is what was missing for me in my studies. I don't know what it was like for you in your studies, Kasim, but it
Yeah.
certainly felt like, oh, this is a missing piece that I can add in now. And in fact, it's the whole
Mm.
piece.
Yeah, for me, it was such a relief to realize it existed, that mindfulness existed, and it brought a whole new dimension with mindfulness-based stress reduction, MBSR. And for listeners who are not aware of it, it's an 8-week program where people join, meet weekly for 8 weeks, and practice meditations, but also go over a curriculum of how to be with ourselves, how to be with stress, our perception. There's a whole curriculum, and it bridges the gap between meditation and life. Like, we learn to meditate in MBSR, but it's about how we are in life. It's not about just how you meditate, which was really beautiful. I wonder, just to go back to a couple of things you were sharing. You were speaking about TM and mindfulness, and for some listeners, some of them may not know, like, what is TM versus mindfulness. So, what is TM versus mindfulness?
That's a great question. So, TM is Transcendental Meditation. And essentially, when I was taught Transcendental Meditation, I was taught a secret mantra that I wasn't allowed to share with anyone. And funnily enough, I've still never shared what that mantra is.
Yeah.
And
Which
and
is the word you repeat, right? The mantra is
exactly.
something you repeat.
It's
Yeah.
exactly. So it's a word that you just say to yourself again and again. And of course, the mind gets distracted and wanders. But instead of like worrying about the mind, the essence of it is just repeating this mantra. And for me,
Mm,
that gave me a capacity to develop a deepening concentration. But as you beautifully said, Kasim, it didn't translate
mm,
into the other moments of my life. So while I probably got quite
mm,
good at repeating my mantra and accessing levels of I guess, better regulation, it didn't
mm,
translate into what was going on when I was at university and my mind was busy and I was worrying about exams and I was figuring out life. It didn't necessarily translate to the different moments, my relationships, all the different components of my life. So the beauty
mm.
of mindfulness is that we recognize that, oh, my whole life is the meditation. What
Yeah.
I do on my meditation cushion is just, additional practice to the entirety of my life. And that's the real practice.
See that connection on the cushion, so to speak, or the chair, or however we meditate, that spills into daily life. And the more we notice it in daily life, the more we want to practice. And sometimes it's called, formal versus informal practice. But you're saying something about TM as an example.
Mm.
It's a calming, very calming to the mind, very centering. And there's a lot of great meditations out there. But that's what's different. I'm finding with mindfulness and I get this question a lot. People say, "Give me a quick strategy to calm my mind." And mindfulness is not just a quick technique to magically make thoughts stop, right? It's not that. So I'm wondering how have you seen, whether from your own experience or places you share it, like how does this mindfulness practice help us in daily life? Could be work setting too.
Yeah, it would be so wonderful if we just had like a magic thing that could make our minds stop. um, but we would miss something really important, which is,
Mm,
the gift of knowing the mind. Yeah, I think we have a tendency sometimes,
mm,
even as meditators, to demonize the mind. Oh no, too many thoughts. But if we can recognize that we have this capacity to to see the thoughts, even to appreciate the thoughts, even to have a sense of
mm.
humor. I mean, I find that I need that often, like a sense of lightness or humor
Yeah.
when I notice what my mind is doing in my daily practices. Um, if we can hold the mind and relate to the mind in a different way, then we might find that that
Mm,
transforms how we relate to everything else. So it's the gift of this
mm,
practice is recognizing that, oh, we don't have to stop the mind at all. What we want to do is cultivate a different kind of more compassionate, interested, curious relationship with this thing that we call mind. And in the recognition of
mm,
that, we might have moments of recognizing that actually maybe I'm not any of these thoughts. Maybe my awareness is vaster than any of these thoughts. And so there's
mm,
the gift of like this growing capacity to be with thoughts like we would be with the different aspects of a river. Sometimes the river is like
mm,
charging ahead, sometimes the river is lovely and clear and peaceful, and we don't judge the river. We can just witness the river and kind of
mm,
even befriend and love the river for all that it
mm,
provides. And so for me, it's more about cultivating that capacity to be with my thinking, and also to
mm,
be in my experience in my body, in a completely different way. And that for me
mm,
feels more beneficial, because I think there's so many interesting things that happen in our minds on a daily basis, in terms of our relationships, in terms of the things that happen every day. And if we can
yeah.
watch that with more curiosity and lightness, then that can transform how we actually are with ourselves, how we are with each other, how we meet the moments of our lives.
Mm. And it all begins with how we meet ourself, as you're describing it. It's how we meet ourself when thoughts arise, not if, but when they arise in practice and emotions arise or sensations in the body arise. How do we be with those? And I really appreciate how you described it, because it really gave the sense of relating. Like, how do we relate when I have a thought that I don't want? Am I fighting it? Am I resisting it? Am I blaming myself? And now we're reacting. So there's a whole component of learning to be with ourselves, but with a new way, kindness, compassion.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I feel that is, for me, that was one of the real keys. And it is one of the real keys, is this cultivating not only attention, but a kind attention, a loving attention, dare I say.
Mm.
Um, an attention that meets everything that's here with acceptance, with equanimity, with care. because it's that old cliche, but for me it feels very true that if we can meet ourselves in that way, we might meet those around us with a little bit more of that capacity. But if we are really struggling, I find that when I'm struggling inside of myself and judging myself, everything contracts, and then the way that I meet
Yeah.
everybody else also gets contracted. So that point of softening and
Mm.
recognizing that inner critic or that judgmental mind that's got its own story, and sometimes that story is relentless and very familiar. But at that point of being able to catch it and soften it, we have a choice to reflect kindness towards ourselves, and then that gives us
Mm.
a choice to reflect outwards in a different way.
Which really helps us even like decision making. If we're making decisions out of reactivity or upsetness, it's very different than kindness, compassion. And when you were describing earlier the spaciousness of the river, like I felt space, like, oh, I'm not just my thoughts. I'm having an upsetting thought, but I'm not the thought. So there's something about being with. I wonder if we bring it to leadership. So how can mindfulness help in leadership and corporate world? Because people are busy, and corporate world is stressful. Who's got time to sit and meditate? And I think that's a thing that I hear often. It's like, I'm too busy. Uh, but what have you seen? Because that's one of the areas of your expertise is mindfulness and leadership. So what have you discovered there? And can you tell us about why it's important in organizations? Why is mindfulness important in organizations?
It's, yeah, I think it's the key to organizations. In fact, for me, I think it's the key to transforming what's happening in the world at the moment, because I think so much of what
Mm.
happens in organizations is about pushing, it's about kind of the bottom line. It's about being effective. And all of those things are really important in organizations. But what gets missed is an understanding of the human being, of our humanity, of our relationality,
Mm.
of an understanding of our planet, an understanding of how are we going to make this planet much more sustainable? How are we going to think deeply
Yeah.
what it means to be a leader? So for me, these practices can hit so many different layers, from the very, from the layer
Mm.
of the, the person in the corporate world who's just stressed every day, because every day there are demands, there are deadlines. I always laugh at that word deadlines. I always underline the dead in the line, because
The,
it literally feels like that for people for those that I teach in the corporate world. Often, it literally feels like if they don't get this thing done, they are, everything's going to collapse. And very often it's them that
yeah.
collapses because they've had all these deadlines and that amount of stress. That's not sustainable.
Mm.
Um, on the individual, and then it becomes not sustainable in terms of relationships in the organization, and then it becomes not sustainable in terms of the bigger picture of
Mm.
organizations. So there's so many different layers of which being more present, learning to slow down, learning to meet what's uncomfortable becomes the hugest
Mm.
challenge for those in the corporate space, but also the hugest gift. So, it's taken a while. I've taught at this business school for some time, and it's always a bit
Mm.
of a shock when I walk into the room with my meditation bells, and the students who are very type A are suddenly encouraged to slow down and meet themselves, because they're like, well,
Mm.
we're here to learn finance, we're here to learn, make more money. And here, the business school where I work, they've kind of understood the importance of really developing leaders that are connected and able to respond to our
Mm.
complex times with more wisdom and more care. And that for me is, the essence of
Wow.
mindfulness practice, right? It's, of course, in MBSR, we're teaching it in order to manage stress, but it has so many deeper
Mhm.
layers to it, because ultimately we want to work towards how do we meet ourselves with more wisdom and compassion, and how do we meet
Mm.
each other with more wisdom and care, and then how do we meet the bigger organizational picture with those qualities. And very often in organizations, there are those values. They really want to live them, but to really
Yeah.
experience that in an embodied way takes actually meeting oneself in a slowed down kind of way.
Mm.
So it's a challenge because it is, as you say, Kasim, so beautifully. Like people just want to well, just give me the quick thing. Tell me how to be mindful
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
in 5 minutes.
Yeah, it will fix everything. Give me a trick, like a quick strategy that no one knows that can just poof like this.
Exactly. And that's not to undermine
Mm.
that teaching short practices in the workspace is really useful. Teaching
Mm.
something like when you're at a
Yes.
board meeting, like where's your attention and can you actually feel your breath and can you then tune in to really hearing what is being said, or are you distracted,
Mm.
bored, irritated? So just even small practices like that, I have found, can be very transformational for people. I've taught
Mm.
corporates in the corporate space, and sometimes I remember one corporate that I taught, and they had to take a 40-day something. They had to change one thing for 40 days, and then they had to write about it. And I remember this one very stressed out exec decided that when he came home, what he was going to do is he was going to sit down with his little daughter. And instead of being busy on his phone and being distracted, he would sit down with her
Ah.
for just 5 minutes and just be present to her. And then he wrote about,
Mm.
being under the blanket with her and talking to her and, listening to her. And for 40 days, he did that. He didn't meditate. He didn't do another like deep,
Mm.
like yoga or walking meditation, but he did that.
Yeah, yeah.
And what happened was that that
Mm.
practice expanded into noticing other people, noticing how he was in
Mm.
the workplace, noticing how he was in an email. And so, I do believe that, or I've
Ah.
learned that maybe people aren't going to be doing a 40-minute body scan as they would in MBSR, but perhaps
Mm.
just learning small practices that can
Yeah.
ground one during the day and connect and anchor you to the moment might bring a different way of relating.
Mm. And being present. What a great example you shared about practically how someone can benefit. I mean, this person you're sharing, they're more present with their family now because they know where their mind is. Like, okay, where is my mind? Let's focus on hearing my child or my pet, or in the boardroom, like, am I planning my lunch or am I actually listening to what they're saying? Am I, the multitasking we get into? So really there's something that's available to us, what you're saying, even with shorter practices, right?
Yeah.
So it doesn't have to be you have to go to Himalayan somewhere and practice for months. It's just short practices and we're good.
Dismiss the beauty of those people who do engage with the more formal practices, because it is like
Mm,
a muscle that gets built the more one practices. But I've been really surprised at some of the stories that people bring back to me about small things that they've done and how that's shifted something
yeah.
for them.
So consistency is really important, and for listeners not to get caught in, oh, I did only this much practice, it's not good enough. I got to do this much. So if you have a 40-minute, great. Some days it may be shorter, great. Some just practicing whatever we can, practicing. Yeah. I'm wondering, is there, from your experience, so you're not only teaching graduate school, but you're teaching organizations. Are there some misconceptions that you face as you introduce mindfulness to busy people, whether it's corporate world? Like, is there some misconceptions about mindfulness that you have to often face and debunk some myths, or what comes up for you as you teach these settings?
Um, I think there are all kinds of misconceptions. In the beginning, sometimes my class was known as the sleep class, because people,
Sleep class.
of course, because people would come in, slow down, they'd recognize how tired they were, do a body scan, and they were finished. They were so tired. So
They're out.
it was like, the definition of mindfulness, of course, is falling awake to the moment. But for them, because the levels of fatigue were so high, it became known
Mm,
as the sleep class. And I had to really work
yeah.
with them to help them understand, yeah, well, we are becoming more present to just how tired everybody is. And, we can get
Mm,
curious around how are we meeting that tiredness in general. But this is a class about falling awake to what's here, not falling asleep to what's here. So that's certainly, a misperception that's there. And there are many more misperceptions, as you
mm.
say. People think that if they meditate, suddenly the mind will go quiet, which is not the case.
Yeah, there's a lot of things we hear out there about mindfulness, and so there's a lot of misconceptions. So thank you for sharing some of those. Of
The other one is that I pick up is there's this idea now that mindfulness is some kind of super bullet. That if or magic
yeah.
bullet, that if I do this, like everything's going to be okay, and I'm going to be so efficient in my work. I'm going to be super focused, and it's really interesting because it is clear that we develop more concentration, more focus, we can become more
Mm,
efficient. But what I found, certainly one of the stories that I really laughed at when I was doing my PhD, is that for some people, they started to recognize that they didn't want to work that hard anymore. They didn't want to be as efficient and as focused. They didn't want to be superhuman. And in fact, they
yeah.
recognized that they wanted to shift their priorities and their values. So this idea that mindfulness is going to, in the corporate space, make you super effective and efficient is true to some degree, but it can also bring people more in
Mm,
touch with what am I actually doing and why, and how does that actually feel for me? So it can
mm,
bring far more of a
yeah.
curiosity to what's going on. It can bring far more curiosity to like the power dynamics that are going on in the workplace and much more
Yeah.
access to what they're really feeling in the face of those power dynamics, which might lead to different choices
Mm,
in terms of how they speak up or question. So it's not always this,
mm.
doing the practice is going to make you so peaceful and super powered.
This walking peacefulness. I think sometimes there is that. I won't experience any painful emotions or thoughts. I'll be just floating the world. It's like no, we still feel as much. In fact, because we're tuned in.
Yeah,
But how this example you shared, it's getting a perspective on how are we living. Is it helpful? And maybe doing 7 more emails is like enough. Like maybe we need to stop. So we're examining how we're approaching things. And I think what you just shared also, takes care of the myth that oh, you do mindfulness, you're just going to turn into this lazy person. And you're just going to sit around and just watch the leaves fall and do nothing. But it's not about an action, it's knowing when it's enough and when we need action. What would you say?
absolutely. It's about wise action,
Mm,
and um,
yeah.
that is, I guess, that is the other thing that I hear from people, and also in my studies, I discovered is that people actually did find that they got more efficient and more effective. So because they were far more conscious around, do I need to do this email? Is there a different way to do this? Can I be more creative in how I approach this problem? So
Mm,
actually, there is a degree of creativity and efficiency that does develop. The other funny story that I have to share with you, Kasim, is I remember one person who became very so efficient, but then, and actually felt so relaxed at work. He really started to feel really relaxed. And the conundrum for him was that when people, usually, you know what it's like in the workspace, people kind of believe that if you say, "How are you?" "I'm so stressed, I'm so busy," like that's the badge of honor. And so
That's
for
a good
him,
thing. Yeah, yeah.
that's for like, that's how you're really making it. But for him, he was feeling relaxed and efficient and wonderful. And so when people would say, "How are you?" he felt this conundrum, do I say I'm feeling relaxed and peaceful and wonderful, or do I say I'm feeling stressed and busy? Just to kind of put up that front. And so it's something really
Mm,
interesting to watch inside of ourselves, that very often we get conditioned to believe that being productive, pushing, over pushing, that's
yeah.
where the credit is. But actually working in a way that is restful, thoughtful, um, self-caring, sustainable,
Mm.
often doesn't get the same kind of rap.
Oh, I love how you said this because it counters this the hustle culture we're in. The like do 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 do. The more you do, the more you're busy and stressed. That means you're being productive. That means you're someone who's progressing in life somehow. So there's and maybe there's another way. Like you're saying, wait a minute, maybe in organization at work or just in life, if we take time for ourselves, maybe we can be more present and don't have to be sprinting all the time and still get there. Like it's not we're not going to get there. We may even get there maybe same time, maybe faster. Who knows?
And there it is,
Yeah.
this idea that there's a there that we have to get to. Whereas in actual fact, I think so
Mm,
much that happens in the workspace is about relationality and connection, that so much can happen just through that. And that gets kind of downplayed
mm,
and underestimated. So, yeah, of course, there's bottom lines and deadlines and projects that need to be completed, and so we're trying to get there. But often in the trying to get there, relationships suffer, connections at work suffer, and the work itself then suffers. So it's
mm.
quite interesting to start to shift that paradigm into a paradigm of like, well, what if we met ourselves with more care and more rest in the
Ah,
workplace? Yeah, and that's a bit of a radical idea.
yes.
But I think, in a way, people are a little desperate for it as well. Yeah.
Hello, everyone. I just wanted to quickly thank you for stopping by and watching this content. It truly means the world to me that you're interested in creating positive change. I also want to invite you to join our amazing community. I have free events online about mindfulness, mindfulness based stress reduction, laughter, as well as retreats that you can do from the comfort of your own home. And are you ready for this? Self paced program that you can do about mindfulness and stress reduction. So you can join the newsletter below to stay up to date on all these goodies. And if you haven't subscribed, go ahead and press that button. It really helps me to keep this content going and reach out to more guests. Thank you so much again, and may you continue enjoying watching this episode. I think we're all hungry for more of that, more taking care of things, more compassion. Like, but we may not have the words for it or know how to do it. But it's. I think we're thirsty for more in the world. Thirsty for that.
I feel that, I feel that,
Yeah.
when we are so stressed and so busy and so productive, what gets missed is our relationality and our connection and our humanity.
Mm.
And I think that we're hungry for that, and I think we're hungry for space just to connect with ourselves, our deepest selves, not
Mm.
the part that and this is where coming back to the start of our conversation, the part that's already whole. having access to that, as opposed to
Yeah.
the part that believes that if I do more, complete more, compete more, and better than you, and grasping over the next
Yeah.
thing, then I'm worthwhile.
Yeah. That's very conditional. Like when I get this promotion or when I get this much money, then I'm a whole complete human being. Or when I meet whatever, this person and this journey of mindfulness telling us, well, as you're saying, maybe it's already here, already complete as you are. And the rest is just bonus. Like, okay, great. Get the promotion. But let's not put the value of who we are as a human being based on the external. I guess that's what I'm getting.
Yeah,
Is that right?
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, because
Mm.
we're always going to be grasping. It's the nature of our human mind, and of course we always want to be developing ourselves. There's something really beautiful about that
Mm.
desire to keep growing and keep developing. But when it's at the expense of joy and connection and love, and really valuing the lives that we have, then I think we can start to bring a curiosity to what actually are we doing here.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Well, then we're missing out on moments in our life. We're missing out on moments and days and weeks and years. And next thing you know, wow, where did that go?
that's right. And I'm sure
Yeah.
you've had that
Yeah.
many times, Kasim, people coming to you and saying, like, like, where did my life go? And I've missed
Yeah.
all of these years.
It goes faster than we think. That's for sure. I want to go back to something that you named earlier, which is about taking action. So, what is the role of mindfulness and activism?
Yeah, I have in a way, I think mindfulness is the activism. So I think because again, so much of what we've been trained to do is to keep pushing and not get curious, not slow down. So for me, the activism
Mm,
actually is in slowing down and being able to learn to turn towards what's uncomfortable inside of ourselves first.
mm,
Um, and then, of course, that gives us the skill to be able to turn towards what's uncomfortable in our world and to think deeply about how do
mm,
I want to meet that and what are the creative solutions that I have to meet that particular problem. Very often, the issue though is that we're too scared to turn towards uncomfortable things. I mean, climate change, I think, is an
mm,
example of that. It's just so scary for us to turn towards the facts and the figures and what's happening in the world that I think we
yeah.
tend to numb out, and we tend not to have the skills and the capacities to meet that incredible despair and discomfort and grief or all those difficult emotions that is there for us when we contemplate these deeply complex
Mm,
issues of our times. But for me, the activism isn't actually being able to slow down and meet the discomfort,
mm.
talk about it, connect around it. And from
Ah,
that space, we might find ways to bring creative solutions in our little corner of the world, our little pocket, our
mm.
little space.
It feels more wise action can emerge from a place of more stillness, clarity, rather than even if you want to create some grassroots change, if it's out of anger or upsetness, it's very different than a place of connecting to ourself and the practice and then letting things emerge and bringing it to creating activism, bringing compassion and kindness. Yeah.
Yeah, which is very different because we have this idea of activism, yeah, of course you have to be like, one understanding of activism is you have to be fired up and angry to make a change. But I think if it's anger
Mm.
that's not held with consciousness, and anger that divides, into polarities, and doesn't have the
Ah.
capacity to sit with the complexities of everything that's here, I think we might keep recreating the problem. Um,
Yes. Yes. And I'm sure in the context you're in, I'm wondering, like, over the years, what have you noticed in terms of challenges and opportunities with mindfulness in the South African context. I'm curious because here I am in Vancouver, Canada, and you're in Cape Town, South Africa, and I'm wondering, like, how has what's particular to your region?
Yeah, thanks, Kasim. That's such a huge question, because
Mm.
when I started with MBSR and kind of brought it here with my colleague, uh, 25 years ago or something like that.
Yes,
I've lost track of the years.
this is the mindfulness. Yeah.
um, you know, and we through the years developed a teacher training based on MBA, based on
Mm.
what we thought was relevant was more mindfulness based interventions, because you might know that
Mm.
South Africa's got a history of apartheid, and that is
Mhm.
separation in its extreme. So
Yeah.
it's a it's been a deeply historically traumatized society, a society where there's been a lot of violence, a lot of socio-economic discrepancies,
Mm.
a lot of issues that we've had to deal with. But for me, the main thing was the recognition that, well, South Africa is unique in that it has its own levels of trauma. It's got a particular history. And
Mm.
so while we've trained a lot of teachers now in mindfulness based stress reduction and mindfulness based interventions, what we're now starting to do is shift our training. And so our teacher training that we run here is a new development that we have, where our focus has really
Mm.
turned into more about how do we train people who are in communities around South Africa and actually beyond the South African borders. How do we train them to share the practice of mindfulness as opposed to be a
Mm.
mindfulness based stress reduction teacher or an MBC teacher? And that's still possible, but the initial foundation
Yeah.
is about how can we bring these practices to communities that would have never had them otherwise? How can we bring these
Mm.
practices to, communities of refugees or extremely disadvantaged
Wow.
communities who've had nothing, and wouldn't even have any of these practices, wouldn't have access to the books and the recordings and all the
Mm.
amazing things that we have. And so we've shifted the training to really start to look at trauma, to look at relationality, to look at
Mm.
how to bring these practices into community, and also to honor
Mm.
that in South Africa there is something already here which you might have heard of, the word Ubuntu, which is
Mm.
innate in the cosmology here, this understanding that I am because you are. Right, and that we're not
Mm.
separate, and that is so much of the community that is already here, the ethos that is already here. And so for us to come and like land mindfulness without a recognition that there's already something here. I don't know if you know
Mm.
anything about Nelson Mandela, who spent
Mm.
27 years in prison on Robben Island.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
because of this capacity for Ubuntu, could leave that prison with a heart that could appreciate even the prison guards that held him captive for those 27 years. And he said that if people can learn to hate, they can surely learn to surely be taught to love. And that's the
Mm.
intentionality behind Ubuntu. This actual understanding that the human heart has this capacity for love, for healing, for forgiveness. And you can imagine what that must have
Mm.
taken for him, having been locked up in this
Wow.
tiny cell for 27 years and to come out with that kind of capacity. So I think
Mm.
we really in South Africa are trying to honor what is already here on the ground and also add in the practices. So we've kind of shifted things on the
Mm.
head for a little bit. It's new, and we're seeing how that works after years of just teaching the
Mm.
formal, mindfulness-based interventions. We're now seeing what's really going to serve this country now. How are we really going to bring these
Mm.
practices out to places and people that would not ordinarily have them? So,
So it's really honoring like the ground you're on, the culture, the context, and it just feels like that's the practice. You've connected with what's needed rather what you think is needed. Like you kind of went to the from the ground up and creating these new programs and exploring new ways of sharing this work. I love that story of Nelson Mandela and this. After all these years, isn't it so easy to choose hate after being in prison for 27 years? So isn't it easy to just to choose hate? But is it helpful to choose hate? And he chose love. Like what a profound story that he really exemplified.
and how that,
Yeah.
his being then rippled through this country when we went through that transition, because it could have been very different.
Mm.
There could have been really an outspilling of hatred, and it's not that we don't have a huge amount of trauma and violence and things that we're still dealing with.
Yeah.
But I think that, what he modeled was this capacity for
Mm.
human care and human kindness. So, in South Africa, we even
Yeah.
have a Mandela Day where everybody gets to, donate a portion of their time to community, to something, to some cause. What
Ah.
a beautiful legacy. And that just is a legacy of someone who, really lived from the space of the heart and, knew how to bring healing in that way. Yeah.
Can you say more about that? That's beautiful. So Mandela Day is it's a day in the year where everyone is encouraged to do kind things. Like just to say more about that. That's beautiful.
So everybody can go out, you can go and make sandwiches, you can go and, create gift boxes, you can go and read to
Mm.
grannies, there are loads of things that you can create your own project. But we all are encouraged on that day to go and do something that is out of our
Mm.
usual daily routine. And corporates get involved, and there are big projects that bring in people so that you can go and experience what they do. And it's one day where you remember the legacy of Mandela, not just through like speeches, but actually through
Yeah.
the embodiment of
Yeah.
of the heart that he brought.
An example of non-violence and power. Like what a transformative force that's possible actually through kindness and compassion, which is actually a misconception sometimes when people practice mindfulness. Oh, am I gonna turn into this like doormat
Mm,
and I'm just I say okay to bad things and I'm just kind, but that's not what it is. It's sometimes taking action, fierce, but not from anger, like Nelson Mandela, but from clarity and compassion and creating the ripples of change.
yeah. It's
Yeah.
beautifully expressed by
Yeah.
Zen, to recognize
Yeah.
that we have this capacity to create ripples of change, even in small ways. Because I think
Mm.
often in the face of our busy, stressful lives, we tend to not recognize that everything that we do, how we meet people in our lives, everything can have a ripple effect. How you meet someone in the supermarket can have a ripple effect. The way you smile at
Yeah.
someone when you walk past them can have a ripple effect. So it doesn't have to be this big leg like Nelson Mandela's legacy, but understanding that, when we have
Yeah.
access to our hearts, we have a capacity to change things in small moments of our lives, and then that can have a ripple
Mm.
effect. For me, it feels like there's a power in that, and that's really how Nelson Mandela was. In fact, that's how John Kabat-Zinn
Mm.
is as well. It's like when you're around John, it's really such a sense of the way that he's meeting everyone with presence.
Yeah.
And there's a ripple effect of that.
And for those who are not familiar, John Kabat-Zinn is the person who developed mindfulness-based stress reduction in BSR, and he was a molecular biologist with deep practice and created this program, since 1979. That's become one of the gold standards, the effectiveness of mindfulness, and well researched. So thank you for sharing that. Yeah. This has been so rich and enjoyable. And I'm wondering, just before we bring it to a close, if you can just share a little bit about things that you have on your website, programs you have. So you have training, and I think you have two websites. One is Be Awake, and I'll put in the show notes. And what is your second website?
The second website, I will give you the link. It's a new
Yes.
development. It's a website called Inara, and the meaning of Inara is
Yeah.
a Arabic word which is shining light, and essentially it was
Yeah.
born out of part of what we were talking about today, Kasim. That recognition that there's a hunger, particularly for those who are working stressed in the corporate space, maybe want to be the kind of leader that leads in a more embodied, heartful way. That
Mm,
there needs to be a space in which they can have some space to reflect, to practice. So we don't just have mindfulness meditation in there, but we're putting
mm,
in different self-development practices to allow them some space to reflect, to connect with self, to connect with each other, and to
mm,
really think about, what we want to live into as leaders. Because of course,
mm.
Kasim, we are all leaders. I don't think, you don't have to be the head
Yeah.
of a corporate to understand that we are all leaders in this day and age in one way or another. And so it's about
Yeah.
creating a space where we can recognize that we are all leaders in one kind of way, and that we need space to connect with
Mm,
each other, to inspire each other, to support each other, to relate to each other. And very often in our busy lives, there isn't that kind of capacity. And there aren't the kinds of safe
right.
spaces or almost sanctuaries. So Inara is more like an online sanctuary where we can meet you, you can meet other people, we can do some movement together. We can sit and reflect. I also share the practice of yoga
Mm,
nidra, which is the practice of deep rest, because as we were
yeah.
saying, I really feel like
Yeah.
people need that practice too. And we create a space where we're creating a space where we can get more curious around what we need as leaders, and what do we want
Mm,
to bring into this world, and how can we find
mm,
creative, inspired ways of meeting ourselves and meeting each other. So that's
mm.
new territory, but we're really excited about it.
Beautiful. So it seems like it has both components where it's live online, but there's components that someone can do on their own as well, through the Inara
Yes.
website.
Yeah, so it's still in
Both. Yeah.
development, but there will be like a signature journey that they can go through, where there's all
Mm,
kinds of, well, there's 8 doors of exploration, but it will be held because we find that there's so much online stuff which people are like bombarded with, but they're not really held through
mm,
that. So it's really about building a community and a safe place to explore, and there'll be programs to explore, but there will also be, offerings of dropping into a class of yoga nidra,
mm.
for example, or there's a dream group where they'll be exploring and sharing depth of dreams, and so
Oh, wow.
yeah, it's really wonderful. So it will offer that space of deep development and deep connection, in a very related
Mm,
and compassionate, caring space where we want, and what's
mm,
beautiful about what's been happening through the year is we're finding that people are landing in the space from all over the world. So we've got Kenya and Switzerland and South Africa and, America and, so there's this
yes.
whole, like, bowl of people that are from different parts of the world sharing a practice, enjoying being human, enjoying the connection,
Mm,
also sharing the struggle, so it's not all about sweetness and light, but there's room for the struggle,
yeah.
and being together with it.
what a wonderful opening that you created through this platform, and look forward. You may see me there. Who knows?
Oh, we would love we they can say delightful. We'll get to interview you on our podcast.
Would love that. Absolutely, absolutely. And I'll put the link to the show in the show notes below, so listeners can check it out. And the other thing I'm curious about, final question I have for you is, the name of the podcast is Pause to Elevate. And besides all the meditations and mindfulness practices, I'm wondering what comes up to mind that has helped you as a form of pausing, whether it's stepping back and reflecting, or what helps you pause to elevate for you.
The first thing that comes to my mind, Kasim, is my dog who's snoring here. Because of course,
Yeah,
when I connect with her, like everything stops, and she reminds me of,
yeah.
just the joy, the non unconditional love, connection. She's like, put all that stuff down, like. Um, but
I love that.
linked to that, I think the real elevation and the real pausing can happen for us when we connect to nature. And it doesn't
Mm,
have to be something big. It's not like we have to go to the forests to connect with nature. Just pausing and looking at the sky and watching the clouds go by in the sky, for me, is a
mm,
way of pausing to elevate.
yeah.
Just noticing, I live close to the sea. Every day, the sea is a
Mm,
different color, the waves are different, there are different activities happening,
yeah.
people doing different things around the water. There's so much richness in just being able to
Mm,
take in, wherever you are, a little bit of
yeah.
whatever nature is here.
It's so available to all of us wherever we are. There's the ground we're on, and there's the sky that we can see. So or sense. It's
Absolutely.
like there's, yeah,
Yeah.
so beautifully said. It's interesting, you're talking about and what kind of dog do you have?
I'll have to send you a photo of her. She's a King Charles Cavalier.
Y-
She's very royal.
Oh, beautiful. I've been just in the process of learning about different breeds because I'm looking at getting my first dog. I've always had birds and parrots, but this was and I'm looking at a couple of breeds. So I was always curious, and you're getting me more excited even
I'm
getting my
so
first puppy.
excited for you, Kasim. I have a
I may have to contact you with some tips, but
Me and Tara will be there for you.
oh, thank you.
I'll have to keep